My name is Diana Oreto, and I run research and the Global Standards Mapping Initiative at GBBC. We have run a working group on DeFi and governance, and it's my pleasure today to be joined by our co-chairs, Lee Schneider from Ava Labs and Joe Cutler from Perkins Coie, where we will discuss the report, the landscape we've put together, and latest trends on DeFi and standards. We're so grateful for your contributions to this work, and I'll let Lee and Joe introduce themselves briefly. Please tell us your role and your main area of focus. If you could get us started, Lee.
Hi, everybody. I am Lee Schneider. I am the General Counsel at Ava Labs. We do a lot of work on the Avalanche blockchain as well as developing other blockchain-related technologies. I've been a lawyer in the space for a little while now, seen a lot of cool things, and am very excited about what's going to happen over the next few years, since I think there's a lot more cool stuff to come.
Wonderful. And Joe, please introduce yourself.
Hello, everybody. My name is Joe Cutler. I am a partner at Perkins Coie, and I am the chair of our FinTech and blockchain practice, and I've been working in this space since almost the inception, and have been working on anti-money laundering and licensing and a bunch of other compliance-related work. I'm also a privacy lawyer by training, and so we may get into a little bit of that when it comes to sort of the data implications of this exciting technology.
Well, that's so good. I'm so proud of all the work that you both have done in the DeFi space toward greater security, governance, and trust overall. Throughout our journey as a working group together, we and a number of stakeholders combined forces to bridge the gap between crypto-native financial systems and institutional and regulatory requirements, where we focused on what it actually takes for decentralized finance to scale within regulated markets. We explored DeFi as an emerging layer of financial infrastructure that enables a wide range of financial infrastructure and services through programmable and globally accessible systems. And the underlying question that we've covered so far is how DeFi can really operate within the governance, controls, and trust required by institutional markets. So along that vein, let's start our discussion on DeFi governance, where we've assessed as a group DeFi governance mechanisms for the purposes of decision-making, resource allocation, and treasury management, and also adaptability for protocol evolution. This led to an in-depth evaluation of decentralized governance mechanisms from voting, proposals, execution of decisions through smart contracts, delegation, governance tokens, and governance updates. And we included considerations of their strengths and weaknesses about each mechanism and what these mechanisms really look like in reality. And ultimately, it's been well pointed out that DAOs are not as decentralized as we'd hope. So starting with Lee, what is really the purpose of DeFi governance, and what differentiates it from traditional corporate governance structures?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, Diana, and it's one that's constantly evolving as new DeFi protocols launch and have different kinds of governance mechanisms, and as other kinds of protocols also outside of DeFi also develop governance mechanisms. I don't know that it's that easy to sort of say what exactly the through line is for all of these, because different people or different projects want governance or install governance for different purposes. One of the things that I often tell projects that are looking for governance is to understand why they want governance and what the purpose of that governance is. To your point about whether or not governance is functioning well, actually, since we finished the report at the beginning of this year, just last week or maybe 2 weeks ago, there's a new report out from the ECB on DeFi governance. And that report talks about some of the challenges that a few of the major protocols have had from a governance standpoint, with concentration of voting, concentration of token holdings, and the use of delegates from a voting standpoint. So there's really a growing literature out there. There's also a bunch of academic literature on this point. And I think we're going to be all assessing what governance looks like for a long time to come. I do just want to make one more point, and then Joe, I'll let you jump in. And that point is, often people confuse the concentration of governance power with a lack of decentralization. And that's actually one critique that I have of the ECB's recent report. And we're planning to do a blog post either later this week or next week at the Avalanche Policy Coalition on this topic. Right? Decentralization is a concept at the infrastructure layer, and it's all about finality of transactions and ownership. Whereas concentration of governance is something that's at a protocol or an application layer, and actually even sits above the application layer. And that concentration of voting power, so long as it doesn't impact what the infrastructure is recording, what the finality is and what the ownership of assets is at the infrastructure layer, is not really a threat to decentralization. Now, there may be good reasons why concentration of governance is not a good thing. That's not the point that I'm making. But rather, the point that I'm making is we need to sort of separate the governance at an application layer with the decentralization at the protocol layer. Joe, please jump in here too.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think there's it, if I could just riff on that a little bit, it's interesting that you mention that, because I agree with you operationally that the concentration of voting doesn't mean that, for example, the technology is less decentralized, right? And I think that's part of the challenge that we have when we equate factual observations about the mechanics of a protocol with sort of the legal concepts, the practical concepts, the governance concepts of power and distribution and influence and authority and truth, right? So to your point, Lee, we, for the second, I mean, this is the second time we've done this working group, and both times it was clear that there still is not a settled vernacular for how we refer to things within the world of blockchain, and then as a subcategory within DeFi. And you raise a really good example. We often equate decentralized or lack of decentralized with a more specific concept, which is who has the influence, who has authority, who can make
Yep.
decisions. Is the DAO independent? Right? And your point is super well taken, that just because you have concentration of voting doesn't mean it's not decentralized, and lack of decentralization doesn't mean that you've sacrificed independence. Those are, I mean, it often does, which is why they try to sometimes equate those things. But I think that's become less of an issue since the new administration has taken over, and in both Paul Atkins and Mike Seelig, they have been, issuing guidance from the day that they arrived that is beginning to unwind these very dichotomic type things, where it's like, well, if it's not decentralized, then it has to be something that is not independent, for example. And I think that we're finding that it's more nuanced than that. And your point is a good one, that there's a lot more room for us to explore how to use a DAO, and by being clear about what its purpose is, and then as a substack of that, what is the purpose of voting? Why do you want to have decision making done in a decentralized way, is an important consideration.
Right. And Joe, I know you had thoughts also on the issues of governance and control, especially as you allude to the much anticipated market structure bill in the US. Is there anything you'd like to add on that?
Sure. You know, I approach a lot of these questions less from just the raw like financial services angle, and DAOs are a great example of protocols that are not applied just to financial services. They're applied to all kinds of projects. And you know, the market structure bill is been a bit of a hot potato in the last few months, where people are trying to look to the market structure bill, I think, to solve all the problems in DeFi and all the problems in blockchain and all the problems in crypto. And I think we're going to find that it falls quite short of that, honestly. I mean, that's my own opinion. But one thing that it will do is I do think that the market structure bill will start to sort between the various federal agencies who's on first for speaking as to how something works. It's interesting to note, just as a preview to that, the SEC recently released guidance purporting to have a taxonomy of crypto, right? A couple of weeks ago, they actually, but if you really think about that carefully, the guidance is very helpful in terms of previewing for us the way that the regulators view different types of token issuances and tokens and their purposes, but it doesn't change the law. And that's a super important point. The market structure bill really isn't going to change the law, even though it's a new law, as much as I think people think it will. What it will do is it will designate, and I think the taxonomy issued by the SEC and CFTC jointly is a helpful guide for Congress, because they can start to use the same vernacular, referring to the same types of tokens, so that we're all talking about the same thing when we refer to stuff. Like a stable coin is going to mean something, right? A utility token is going to mean something. An equitized token is going to mean something. But the market structure bill is really, all it's really going to do is designate which agency gets to speak on the matter first. But if a token is issued and someone calls it something that it's not, you know, they say it's a utility token, but it really has all the trappings of a security, the SEC is still going to have something to do about it and to say about it.
Yes.
And I think that's a very important thing for us to remember. I was struck by how many people, including a bunch of lawyers, got on social media right after the SEC's pronouncements of taxonomy and said, "Oh, the world's fixed now. Now we have clarity as to how tokens should be treated." The guidance itself said, "We're not saying how we're going to treat tokens. We're just telling you what their names are."
Lee, anything you'd like to say on that? Because I know you have a lot of thoughts on taxonomy as well, overall.
I was very pleased that the SEC came out with the taxonomy. You know, we've had token classification system out there for quite some time, and although they didn't adopt the same terminology that we use, and there were some differences, there were a lot of similarities. So I felt really gratified that the SEC is making this move. You know, one area that was not in the taxonomy was governance token, or at least not directly. And that's because it probably falls under the digital utility category that the SEC named. And so I think Joe is absolutely right that the SEC is saying, here's a basic framework, but there's still work to be done by lawyers and by projects to figure out where they fall. So I'm looking forward to all of the work that's associated with that, because I think it's going to continue to pose really interesting questions for lawyers. Just circling back to the governance token as part of the taxonomy, right? Like the SEC doesn't say that digital commodities excludes governance tokens. And so it's going to pose some interesting questions as we sort of think through, are governance tokens really digital utilities, digital commodities, et cetera. So I think there's still work to be done, but this has got us off to a good start.
Great, fantastic overview, so helpful and clear. What about going into liability implications, the next part of our discussion? Liability implications, risk and AML, where across our work together, and I can't say this past year, but really this past 2 years, we raised a series of open questions for DeFi that key stakeholders still need to address. And this includes the importance of regulatory clarity for core financial legal frameworks and new market structure, defining decentralization and accountability in this new context of DeFi, the role of compliance and what should be done around it. And ultimately, DeFi's path towards scale and institutionalization would depend on resolving kind of tensions between decentralization in the context of legal governance and risk frameworks that are required for the trust that we are all used to. And my question here is, how do U.S. legal notions of money transmission interpret custody? And what new considerations does DeFi raise? And how would this impact liability? I'm going to start with Lee, but I'm going to let Joe and Lee, either one of you, get started to pick up on this discussion.
I'll just throw out there that this is conceptually one of the things that this ECB paper seeks to address. Now, they don't come up with any proposed solutions and everything like that, but one of the points they seem to be making is that as you have this concentration of governance power, but you also have opacity or opacity, depending on how you pronounce it, about who is behind the governance in this sort of concentrated governance power, that maybe there is a road there for attaching regulation to certain parties. I didn't find that argument particularly persuasive, but that's something that is very much underdeveloped in the paper and I think needs more development. But the only other thing I'll say here, and then I'll turn it over to Joe, is these questions of custody and control in the anti-money laundering context are not easy questions to answer. I think the federal government, in particular FinCEN, has some interpretations that are out there that are very helpful, but there are some cross currents there that seem to want to push the AML obligations down to the infrastructure layer. And that's something that has not been done in traditional financial services, and we see no reason that it needs to be done here. But it is definitely the case that people need to start exploring alternative approaches to AML in a world where traditional intermediaries just are not there.
Yeah. And what about the notion of broker-dealers changing in a DeFi context? And how should also the principles of private law evolve for DeFi? Joe, you have so much experience with that. Please take us away.
Yeah, so I would start by saying, Lee's been talking about DeFi broadly, particularly with respect to sort of DAOs and projects on a decentralized platform or protocol. One of the things we've always debated in these working sessions is whether DeFi should be limited to the financial, like the financial services that are offered on a decentralized basis, or just all projects that include utility tokens for lots of things that are traded in a DeFi context. So I want to focus just for a second on money transmission, and then get into the question you asked, Diana. We are traditionally conditioned, because in the US there are almost 50 states that govern money transmission as a licensure matter, where you have to get a license in order to transmit money. There's been this chain of logic that started in 2013 when FinCEN issued guidance saying, well, if you receive money or monetary value in exchange for another unit of money or monetary value, that exchange can be considered money transmission. And the critical question has always been for us practitioners who are asked by clients day in and day out, do I need a license to do this, is whether you have custody or control of the money or the funds or the tokens or the units of monetary value. And so this notion of non-custodial versus custodial has always been the dividing line for people on whether they need to worry or not worry about regulation. Typically speaking, at the state level, if you don't take control of the funds, which in a token context means you have the private keys or you have control over the movement of the funds on the blockchain. Then if you don't have that, then you typically are outside the scope of any licensure obligations for the states. And that tends to convince people to say they're not money transmitters. However, at the federal level, the definition under the Bank Secrecy Act, which is what FinCEN enforces, is different than that. There is a prong of the definition of money transmitter that includes receipt of money for transmission or other monetary value for transmission, just like the states. But there's another prong that is very often overlooked, very often, it's underused, which is that if you knowingly facilitate money transmission and there's a conjoiner there, and it results in violations of the Bank Secrecy Act in the form of money laundering, there is also liability for that. And you would be considered a money transmitter if you knowingly facilitate the transmission of money in the furtherance of criminal activity. And so it is from that basis that some of the attempted criminal prosecutions, say of the Samurai wallet or of Tornado Cash, were prosecuted. And it is not as clear as a lot of people say that you're out of the box if you don't take custody of the funds, because that facilitation prong could trigger. And so for DeFi protocols, I think that's a particularly worrisome aspect that I have been hoping gets addressed in the market structure bill. I don't know if it will. There's been so much attention to other issues that I don't know if the final version of the market structure bill will resolve this problem. But, aggressive prosecutors have argued that if a developer intends or knows that their software, say a mixer or a tumbler or some kind of privacy protective software that uses a decentralized protocol to move tokens around or exchange private keys in a way that obfuscates where they're going and makes it less public, if that software is known, marketed to, or in some way is overtly facilitating money laundering, there's a hook to be prosecuted under that. And you would be called a money transmitter notionally as a part of that charge. So far, the cases have concluded that when there is overt evidence that the developer was part of the money laundering scheme, they talked about it on Twitter, they marketed their software to launder money, they have liability. On the other hand, if you're an organization, I'll just pick one out of the air, like Uniswap, and you're just marketing a decentralized swapping mechanism as software that people can use on their own without intermediaries, it's unlikely that you're going to be triggering the facilitation prong because you don't have the knowledge, you don't have the intent. But as you can imagine, that's a pretty squishy concept that could cause people to have pause over whether they want to develop protocols that do this. Carla Reyes and I wrote a paper that talks about layer one protocols, meaning the underlying DeFi protocols that are used to create these projects.
Excellent paper so far.
Thank you. The argument in the paper is that we should consider DeFi protocols and layer one protocols as infrastructure, right? And it's public infrastructure. The way you consider the lines of transmission for electricity, or the packet processing for internet traffic. And if you think of it that way, you can see how someone could use a telephone to launder money, right? Wire fraud happens all the time. But the telephone provider that provides the transmission of the text or the line isn't liable for the transmission of the instructions that resulted in wire fraud, unless, of course, the provider was involved. Right? And that's a very simple way of explaining how I think the law should shake out in this space. But people just sort of lose their mind when they talk about crypto. They think it's all kind of mixed together. And so our paper tried to suggest that that regulators consider dividing layer one protocols for targets of regulation from layer two and other forms of more project-based plays on DeFi or on blockchains for regulation. You should regulate the ones that are developing the projects. You might not want to regulate the underlying protocol, or if you do it like public infrastructure, meaning make sure it works, make sure it's safe, make sure it's secure, Like you could regulate that aspect of them, but you probably don't need to say that someone who develops a protocol is liable for everything people build on top of it.
Exactly.
And this is a super important point that Joe's making here about the nature of software development and the nature of implementation of open source software, and particularly with the composability and the ability to build layers on top of layers. It really, you have to sort of think through very carefully what kinds of obligations you want, if any, you want to put on the software developers. And I tend to err on the side of no obligations for software developers, but obligations for the people who are using the protocols, and figuring out what that should look like.
Exactly. Exactly. So as we move to the third part of our conversation on potential solutions or promising approaches to get to the outcomes that we want, given all these open questions, we've also provided industry recommendations that center around establishing a clear and harmonized regulatory framework for DeFi, defining standards for decentralization and control, updating rules for activities like custody, settlement, and exchanges, strengthening private law foundations for digital assets, where, yes, we have referred to the paper that Joe mentioned with Carla Reyes, and improving overall accountability for DAOs and strengthening overall compliance for AML, privacy, and security within the protocol design. Recently, as we also alluded to, we also received guidance from the SEC and the CFTC, including the token taxonomies and addressing a lot of these open questions. So back to Joe, what are forms of regulatory safeguards that could or should be embedded within DeFi, and what would new rulemaking be necessary to achieve this?
Well, you've asked me about a bailiwick of mine that, and so I'm happy to address it. I have long felt like reg tech has lagged behind the fintech aspects of building blockchain and DeFi protocols. And what I mean by that is people have for years been way out on the front leading edge of developing faster throughput, better consensus, more sophisticated developer options, the ability to do cross-chain work. I mean, all the things that you'd want to make a layer one protocol super well, very efficient, very reliable. And there is a dearth, there is literally a vacuum of similar style develop in regulatory compliance embedded within the protocols. You know, the dream in 2012 was to put on blockchains all the abilities that you needed in order to eliminate as many intermediaries as possible. And I think people figured that one day blockchains would replace a cumbersome system where everybody has checks and balances at every spot and a bunch of redundancy. And it's amazing to me that 13 years later, we really don't have any, we're not even close to consensus on what would the standards be. Whether the law, we're still arguing over whether the laws apply, as opposed to saying, perhaps if we take as given that the laws are trying to do something that is public good, meaning stop crime, prevent fraud, make things predictable, and make sure that people get what they say they're going to get.
What
I mean,
everyone
that's
can agree on.
right. I mean, that's what anti-money laundering laws are for. And so I've always wondered why the developers, and this is a criticism, right, of the industry in a way. Like I've always wondered why developers don't spend more money and time building sophisticated tools that do the work of KYC, transaction monitoring, and fraud prevention and AML prevention, like native to the protocol, native, totally embedded and part and parcel to the way it works. There are a lot of projects sort of poking at the edges of this, but I've never seen a single project take it by the horns. And so one recommendation that we talked about in the meetings that I would love to see FinCEN, for example, introduce rulemaking that says simply, here's a list of the obligations that people rely on third parties to do often: KYC, transaction monitoring, transaction reporting, SAR, like suspicious activity monitoring and reporting. And I would love to see rulemaking that says you get a pass from having to do those things the way the law says right now if you present to us technology embedded in your service offering that accomplishes the goals of those requirements to our satisfaction sufficiently. That would spawn the innovation I just said is not happening, because there would be a huge incentive for people to go build it so that they can integrate it and they can basically get rid of all the cumbersome stuff you have to put on top of DeFi, which makes it not so DeFi, to make it work, like KYC, like transaction monitoring, like all the reporting requirements and the staff that it takes to do that. So from my perspective, I would love to see governments be more innovative. Instead of just like ramming more standards down people's throats, I would love to see governments say, hey, let's foster some innovation by giving a carrot and saying you can actually avoid some of the cumbersome parts of this law if you can meet or beat it. Because like, I'll just finish with this. Like, no one ever said that KYC equals AML. Like,
Yeah.
no one ever said that collecting someone's social security number is the right way to do anti-money laundering prevention.
Yeah.
It isn't, right? But we just equate it that way because that's what we've done for 40 years. And I think there's a better way.
Talk about incentives, right? So turning it over to Lee, how does the new guidance that we have now impact current incentives and initiatives to add greater trust and security for DeFi operations? How would this impact institutionalization, especially as institutions are increasingly interested in DeFi opportunities? And we're starting to see some really interesting partnerships between DeFi players and very traditional financial institutions, and also building on the points that Joe had mentioned. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, look, I think this is a very difficult area to parse out right now. And it's difficult for a lot of the reasons that Joe identified. And so I really like his idea of the regulators saying, we're going to let you, DeFi protocols, figure out how best to attack the problem. What I see, and this dovetails with Joe's comment that no one has said that KYC equals AML, we need to look at what the underlying goals are here. And it seems to me that there's two underlying goals. One is identifying the bad actors whose money is flowing here. And two is interdicting or seizing that bad actor money, but doing so in a way that doesn't disadvantage the good actors who may have unknowingly received that bad actor property. So I think there's a lot to think about here, and I don't see any easy solutions. Joe, maybe you and I should try to write a paper on this and propose some broad ideas here, because I think there's a three-way train wreck coming, and one of those trains is called privacy. Another one of those trains is called blockchain, and another one of those trains is called AML. And I don't see too many people trying to figure out how to make sure each of those trains continues down the track without crashing into the other two. So I think there's a lot still to be done here.
So important, especially as we talk about things that are going to ultimately increase growth, profitability. That may mean a more short-term cost now, but in the greater scheme of things, it would be a huge win for everyone. So let's end our conversation. Unfortunately, we're out of time, but I want to pick your brains with a key takeaway from Joe and Lee from the discussion. What is one punchline that you'd like the audience to remember most? One sentence each. If you can do it one word, we can do one word ideally. So I'll let you choose who goes first. Give me a punchline.
I mean, to me, the punchline is infrastructure versus intermediary. We need
Brilliant.
to remember that distinction. We need to say we continue to regulate intermediaries just as we always have done, and we don't regulate infrastructure just like we always have not regulated infrastructure. So to me, that's critical, and keeping that distinction clear in people's minds and not pushing regulation down to the infrastructure layer is absolutely the way that things need to continue to be done.
So well said. Couldn't have said it better. Joe, you're up.
I'll just repeat what I recently said, in that I think the next major step needs to be that regulatory compliance needs to be embedded within the technology as quickly as possible, because regulators are now actively participating. And, we've politically solved the riddle of having blockchain friendly people in high places, but we need to give them the tools that they need to appease the naysayers. And so I think that the next round of success will come by demonstrating, in fact, that blockchain can police itself as well as it can transact itself. And if we can do that, then I think that the political footballs will get put on the ground and we'll be able to actually move forward.
So important.
Very well
DeFi
said.
with RegTech and infrastructure versus intermediaries. I love it. Such a pleasure to work with both of you, as it always has been. Thank you to our audience and all of the work you've put together, and hope to see you soon.
Thank you very much, Diana.
Thanks, Diana.